Today we have another clinical trialist from our CHI clinical trials platform. Dylan is a nutritional biochemist, and his experience in trials is really around a lot of lifestyle interventions and nutritional products. And he's going to talk about good results and registration reporting practices.
Thanks for the introduction, Lauren. So thank you all for coming to this talk on such a wonderful day where I almost don't want to be here either because of all the other things I could be doing. But yeah, we're going to talk about registering and reporting trials. And I think it's I'm sure everybody here understands why it's so important to do that. But it's something that we still are not doing as well as we could generally in a whole field of clinical trialists. And I'm going to jump right in. Why do we need to register and report clinical trials? And I think it's just basically goes down to responsible research conduct. It's part of doing research that's honest and accurate and efficient and objective. Without reporting and registering, we are violating some ethical standards of our research, and we're not conducting research ethically, in my opinion, because the honesty factor is around conveying information truthfully. If we don't register what we want to do beforehand, and then we're reporting it afterwards, no one can know if we actually are reporting what we looked at originally. Accurately is about having a record of what we want to do, and objectively being able to look at the reporting results afterwards and trace them back. It's important to have the trials registered, and it's important to have the trials reported. So registering clinical trials. There are policies on registering clinical trials. Most of the policies that I'll be talking about right now are specifically around the International Clinical, the ICMJE, so it's the journal editors. But they are in line with the WHO registration policies. There's some different registration policies depending on different funding agencies and different types of trials, devices versus clinical trials. But I'm typically going to be talking about the registration you'd need to publish afterwards, and the WO registration, which is what I tend to look at as a researcher who wants to publish clinical trial results in good journals that are affiliated with ICMJE, which is most of the journals that you'd want to publish your results in afterwards, as well as So basically, their guidelines is any clinical trial should be registered. Some registries don't care about phase 0-1, but any clinical trial, so any intervention where you prospectively assign people to an intervention of some kind to measure health outcomes as a clinical trial, and even if you're unsure about the trial, if it should be registered, you can still register it. So just register it if you're unsure. You can even register observational studies and other types of studies that may not necessarily be RCTs, but and throughout, I'm typically going to be talking about clinicaltrials.gov. That's the main registry that most people at this university would use, although there are quite a list of registries you can use around the world. So registering your clinical trials is basically the best way we can prevent against publication bias, selective publication, and selective reporting of outcomes. Those are the two main things that I think registration really goes after. And unnecessary duplication of research is obviously an important one too. If you're about to start a trial or you're looking to put in a grant for a trial and some people are doing the exact same thing, the registries provide you people to talk to, look for experience in doing trials that are similar to yours, potentially collaborators, and maybe ideas to do something slightly different if it's already been done before. And the registries also work as a way to inform the public. So I think that's incredibly important. Patient groups that are interested in, say, maybe patient groups that have certain diseases are interested in the type of research that's ongoing. I myself am a type 1 diabetic. I like to check clinical trials every now and then to see what's happening for type 1 diabetes. Some of the new SGLT1/2 inhibitor studies, metformin in type 1. Most of those informations, they're ongoing studies, and I can only see that through the trial registries because if they haven't been published yet or the abstracts aren't out, I can only see that they're happening from the registries. The most important thing with registration, though, is it has to happen before the studies, because you can't really defend against things like publication bias or outcome switching if the trial's already done. So all the guidelines will tell you. And so I know there are circumstances when the registrations don't happen or someone doesn't release it before, or there's things that can happen, life that can happen in clinical trial research where the registration may not go up in time before the first person's enrolled. Some of the organizations say as long as it's within 30 days of the first participant enrollment. I reviewed a trial recently where they didn't have it until like 6 months afterwards for some reason. But then in the registration, they were open and transparent. They put up information, and in their publications, they explained why that happened. And I think that's something to remember throughout all the registration and results. Always provide as much information as possible. Be specific about it if there's a reason why something didn't happen. It's like with most good clinical practice. Explain why it is and have it there so that other people can find out why when they're trying to look at it afterwards. So some people might say that selective publishing isn't a thing anymore. Probably everybody in this room knows that's not true, but sometimes you get an argument against people who are very strict about registering and reporting trials and say that everybody has an incentive to publish anyway. Researchers, have incentives to publish. Why would they never publish things? And because there are, research is incentivized to publish, but not all clinical trials are run by researchers. There are industry interests, and there's a lot of money to be made in certain trials. And sometimes you don't want to publish all the studies if you're looking for approval. And if you don't even know that a study exists, or you don't publish it, then that's information that's missing from people who are trying to make treatment decisions. So this is work from CHI, where I work, that just came out, I think, last week, looking at RCTs in pediatric research. And they wanted to see how often studies that are published in abstracts, phase 3, I believe it was, studies published in abstracts that are finally published as articles. And over time, it's improved slightly, but it's not great, actually. They had about, all over the place with how many. As you can see, not all of the published abstracts ended up being published. So you had unregistered abstracts versus unregistered registered abstracts, and percent of the articles published. So the registered abstracts tended to have higher percentage rates. You see in there 95, 85, in the 90s and 80s, whereas the unregistered abstracts are 60, 30, 40. One of the big findings is that registered trials were more likely to be published. So it's another reason why to register. Without trial registration, they went through conferences, conference abstracts, looked if there were registrations, and then looked at the publications and matched them up. But without the registries, if someone didn't put a conference abstract in, but they did a trial, we wouldn't even know it existed. So without the registries, you don't know what you don't know. And that's kind of scary, but fortunately, so at this university, you have to.
I had a question about the trials. Were the trials like CTA trials? Or are they all like non-industry trials?
I didn't look at these were just pediatric trials that they could find abstracts for versus I don't the exact criteria I wasn't sure.
So you don't know if they're industry and that they wouldn't be trial would be used for a licensing.
They would still have to publish results at some point, 12 months after the study's finished.
Like in a journal, or they would just put it to their licensing application.
Well,
it's registered.
Yeah, and one of the registration criteria is putting up results.
Yeah, they would put results, but they wouldn't necessarily publish them.
Right, you're right.
Because
so that's
it would go into Health Canada or FDA.
Yeah, you're right. So that's actually I'm not sure if they mentioned that limitation this year in the paper, but I'm going to have to look through. It's a very good point because as you can see, they would still be registered though, so that wouldn't explain that the registered studies were more likely to be published than unregistered studies. But the good news is that registration and publication was improving over time. And there's lots of reasons for that. That's happening. I think that's a good thing. Almost as bad as not publishing or publication bias when you register is outcome switching when you are reporting the outcomes. It seriously distorts the outcomes of clinical trials. If I were to take a shot in golf and I got a hole in one, that would sound pretty impressive. But if there's 20 holes on the green, less impressive. If I got my ball in a hole on a different hole on a different green, also less impressive. And that's basically the analogy for outcome switching. When you pre-specify an outcome and you say this is the main outcome that we think our treatment is going to work on, and you have an effect on that, it's much more impressive than when you say there are 20 things that we're going to look at and we found one, because that already is your chance of finding a p of less than 0.5. So pre-specification of primary outcome is really important. Secondary is key, and being very specific about those things is just key to registering and good clinical practice. So most people have already probably heard about study 329, Paxil in teenagers, but this is always the biggest example, or one of the key examples of outcome switching. It was a randomized controlled trial evaluating Paxil in teens with major depressive disorder. And first, it had 8 outcomes, but it wasn't registered. And then when none of those were different, they looked at they added an additional 19 outcomes. And of those outcomes, 4 of them showed a treatment effect. And then the publications from the study were focused on those 4. So 4 out of 27. Not great. And unfortunately, based on this study, people used it to make treatment decisions and gave Paxil to teens and children. And unfortunately, there was little to no benefit of the Paxil, but there was it was associated with increase in suicidal thinking and suicide attempts. And so this is part of one of the biggest drug, fraud or fines that was paid out. I think GSK paid $3 billion in 2012. Not specifically for just this study, but this type of practices, and this was one of the studies that was involved in that. And that's a place where outcome switching can kill people, and that's why registering is important. It saves lives. A couple of years ago, the Evidence-Based Medicine Center at University, led by Dr. Ben Goldacre, started the COMPARE project. For about a year, they looked at every publication in the major medical journals. I think the top 10, so the big ones, and they went back to the registries and compared the outcomes that were registered and the methods and the reporting and then the publication to those. So they found 67 publications. 9 of them met their criteria. And so if you go to the COMPARE project, they have their criteria laid out. They went through. Basically, if you followed the CONSORT reporting and you reported all of the outcomes or explained why the outcomes that you registered weren't being reported, you could get perfect points. Only 9 of them were perfect, and they found 354 outcomes that were not reported across those 67 studies without explaining why they weren't reported, and they also found 357 new outcomes that were brought in. And it's okay to bring in an outcome later if you say it's new and you explain that it's exploratory, but that wasn't happening in the publications. And so there's quite a few registries, as I mentioned. I think for most, the only registry I've ever used is Clinical Trials. Has anybody else used one other than Clinical Trials? That's the one that's recommended by our REB, I believe. And so it's pretty straightforward. You can definitely find a registry. Not finding a place to register your trial is definitely not a reason to not register it. And there are criteria that are laid out that what needs to go into the registry. The WHO has laid out 24 items. It used to be 20 until pretty recently. They've added 4 more. mostly related to data sharing and individual patient data access. But the main criteria are things like, a primary registry number. So for clinicaltrials.gov, that's generated. The date of registration of the primary registry, which is important because you want that to predate the starting of enrollment. There's a secondary identification number. So when you have your study here, you'll likely get an REB number for your study, and that would typically be your secondary for this, or a sponsor number would go in there. Who supports the study needs to be there, so the primary and secondary sponsors, a general information public contact, and a scientific queries contact needs to be in there. So two separate, they can be the same, but typically you have two separate ones. The public title of the study, so some studies have acronyms that are not, or shortened names that are not particularly descriptive. They need to be in the registry, as well as the scientific title, which the scientific title should name what's in the intervention. There's criteria for the scientific title. The countries that they're recruiting in, obviously the health conditions they're addressing, and the type of intervention. So key inclusion-exclusion criteria also need to be there in the design. So study type, the design of the study is there, and the date of first enrollment. Sample size, recruitment status, so is it ongoing, completed, that type of thing, which needs to be updated. Typically, you want to update these clinical trials so that they're updated. I think the guidelines say every 6 months is what the REB is asking for. Specific primary outcomes and secondary outcomes, where the ethics review or what board reviewed it. And then afterwards, completion date, summary results, and individual participant data sharing statement. And obviously the summary results, it's almost like reporting the results is part of the registration process. And considering some things to consider when entering the items on that 24 item list is be as specific as possible, because a bad registration is almost no better than no registration. If you just put in a pile of outcomes, and some of these registries will flag things from you, but that doesn't necessarily mean the registry won't go up or that the REB here won't release it, because they want you to have registered, and there's often pressure for them to start the studies. But I've seen some registries that are just really bad. If you're not specific about the times or the measures, and so clinicaltrials.gov has gotten better about that. There's a lot more flags now, but the idea of being as specific as possible is really important in the registration, because vague items on a registry just leads to uncertainties and potential for bias, wiggle room afterwards in the reporting, which is never good. And there's guidelines for all the registries. There's guidelines for what should go in them. There's guidelines for how you should use them. What goes in every field is basically specified. So reading the manual helps there. I mean, you just go through each step and do exactly what they say. So why report results? Obviously, hopefully you should already know why you need to report results. It's part of the registration process. But on top of that, why should we report results? Secrecy is really bad in science, I think. I mean, I'm a big proponent of transparency and openness in science. All the way through, you should be as open as possible. I know they don't have this in the registration requirements yet, but I would love to see things like the statistical analysis plan in the registries. And so some of that's related to the design, but they could get more specific. I mean, they could go all the way to where you could affix code to how you want to analyze the data. All of that stuff could be added to your registration, and the more the better is my opinion here. Not reporting clinical trial results is scientific misconduct. Some people might disagree, but I believe that, and I think there's other organizations that see that as that, because when people are participating in a study with you, the individual patients are often consenting with the understanding that they're contributing their time to something that'll better society, better patient outcomes, better treatment decisions. And if you put that results in the file drawer and you don't do it, then you don't publish it, you don't make it public, then you're violating that agreement with those participants. You're wasting the resources that have gone into that study, the coordinator hours, the people who worked on it. All of those things is wasted when you don't report the results. The other thing is, if you do a study and you don't report it and you put it in your file drawer, someone else might have that exact idea to do it, and they waste their time again doing it over and over again. And I think recently in France they had they were doing phase 1 trials of this like an animide derivative, and they had someone die from seizures, right? And it turned out that there were some studies that had similar compounds and had similar side effects that never really made it published. So that type of non-publication can lead to not just waste of resources, but harm when those things, especially related to side effect data, is not published from them. So there's lots of ways to disseminate research and report. I think, again, this is another one where the more the better. As a researcher, that's how I feel about any research that I'm involved with. I try to put it out as many different ways as possible because I think the more people that can see it, the better. I know there are arguments against clinical trial results being too public because some people in the public might misinterpret them, but I haven't seen real evidence that leads to harm when it's out there, because there are people who, there can be very educated members of the public and patient organizations, and they can figure out how to understand the results. This idea that you need to have an MD or a PhD to understand the results of some trials is kind of a little elitist in my mind, and they can use the results and talk to other people about it and bring it to their healthcare professionals. So having the data out there, I think, is really important. There's many different ways as possible. The big ones, obviously, that count towards, say, things like unreported clinical trials and guidelines is their registries and peer-reviewed journals. One of either of those will likely be enough to meet the criteria of having reported your results, but ideally both is better. And with the trial registries now, most of the guidelines are that you put it up within 12 months of the completion date, which actually happens before the study's done in a lot of ways. They want the primary outcome, the baseline characteristics, all of those things. And that doesn't count as pre-publication, according to the journal editors. They have a format for what can go up in the trial registries, and you won't have to worry about the most glamorous of journals turning down your publication because it's already been published. So there's a very large there's an international campaign called the AllTrials campaign. It was also started at the Evidence-Based Medicine Center at Oxford. And they basically are trying to make the idea of trial registration and reporting an attractive media story. They produce content about it. They're lobbying different governments and organizations and funders to change what guidelines they have in. There's new rules around funding in the U.S. The final rule, which basically means you have to have published your previous results to get more money, and other funders are adopting it, as well as things like pushing publishing in open access formats. But I think it's a good program. I've actually joined AllTrials personally. I've signed the pledge. CHI has joined. I would like to work with University of Manitoba to have them join, but obviously we'd have to do some work before we could do that, or at least start a plan to improve our own house before we join the study. And so they have a great website, lots of information on how to join and how to help. And as I said before, when do you start reporting results? 12 months after the final primary completion date. So that's many analyses or follow-up maybe still ongoing, but you're going to be able to put things like baseline characteristics and that kind of stuff. Things like participant arm assignment, completed loss to follow-up, baseline characteristics, primary outcomes. They're going to be able to be put into the trial registries in a short format, usually within 12 months. And if not you can put in a reason why. Not all of them are accepted, but put in a reason why. Be open and transparent about why that is. If there's delays in releasing it because of issues around patents or licensing, etc., there are some acceptable delays, but these measures are not going to stop you from getting those licensing either, or stop you from publishing the results. And so there are guidelines on how to report results too, which is great because then you don't really need to think about it. You just follow the guidelines. And the main one, the main place to get all the guidelines, not just for clinical trials, but for any type of research study, essentially that you're doing. If you want to look at how to report it, you can get it on the Equator network. So CONSORT is the one that you want to look at for clinical trials, and that's the Consolidated Standards for Reporting Trials. I think it was originally, the first one came out in 1996. 2010 has been the most recent update, although there have been many extensions. But it's just basically the main guidelines to reporting a clinical trial. When I go to write up a clinical trial manuscript, or if anyone goes up to writing a clinical trial manuscript, you can basically just follow the CONSORT guidelines step by step, and it fills out the manuscript for you. The CONSORT guidelines are essentially two things. There's a checklist. The checklist has everything that you need to put into your reporting document or your publication or your report. And you can just go through them and check them out one by one. As a graduate student, I loved having this, or if you had someone writing up a small report, you can just tell them, make sure in the order that's there, you write the CONSORT checklist into your manuscript, and then you've covered everything you need to. It's actually 2 pages of it, so it goes all the way from, a lot of these things are exactly what's in the registration requirements too. I'm not sure they have 25 boxes on this one here. There's 24 items on the other one. So I didn't actually look which one's which, but I'm missing. But basically the same type of descriptions that are in your registry, you need to talk about them again in your reporting. And then the CONSORT flow diagram. So, I mean, most journals will require both of these things for publication, with the manuscript for publication. They want you to send in the CONSORT flow diagram. It'll often become the main first figure or second figure in your manuscript, or an adaptation of that. And the checklist is often requested with manuscripts as well. And that just helps the reviewers. So I really like it if I'm reviewing a clinical trial that I can look at the CONSORT checklist. And so since there's all kinds of guidelines on these things, and it's easy step-by-step processes, one would hope that there's really no problem, but you guys already know from the pediatrics study I just talked about that it's still clearly a problem. There's a website called Trials Tracker that, again, is from the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford, and they basically mine the data on clinical trials to look at ones that have been registered versus ones that have been reported. And this is since 2006, and it's not great. And I don't really see a trend in the percent. Well, there's not even a real improvement in the trend. After 2008, it's been pretty standard, a little better than 50%. But overall, 45% of the trials since 2006 haven't had results reported. And this is really the bare minimum. It's either the preliminary or the baseline results, the results for the registry are not in there, or there's been no publication that has reported that clinical trial number. Because clinicaltrial.gov looks through PubMed and captures PubMed entries that have the same clinical trial and imports them. So they almost do the work for the sponsor or the researcher, and still 45% haven't been reporting results. Even worse at the University of Manitoba, I mean, we don't do a huge number of trials, but of the 46 trials, and so they don't include, in this trials tracker, they don't include phase 1 and phase 0 trials, but of the 46 trials, 66% of them haven't reported results. I've downloaded this data set and I've looked at it. There's something that we want to do to improve that. So we started a little initiative called AllTrials MB at the Clinical Trials platform, and we want to do things to improve that number. 46 trials, 66% of them without results reported, it shouldn't be difficult for us to easily bring that down fast. We're only talking about going in and putting results up for maybe 20 trials, and we can go down to maybe 0. We can easily be the best in the U10 or the top 10 universities in Canada by putting a little work into our results reporting, which would be nice, I think. And so our REB forms and our REB process now asks whether, or makes someone attest whether they're going to report results. But we'd like to do more than that. And we've had as a platform some discussions with the REB about how we could incentivize reporting of results. And I'd love to have some ideas put forward on this. One of the things that other universities have is publication officers that make sure trials follow up with researchers and assist people in getting the results up. And there's also some universities have people who actually do the registration for them. And that's something that we're seriously considering as a unit trying to get. Because then all they need is when someone submits to the REB with their protocol, that would then go to the publications person or the registration person. They would help fill out these forms, and they would also be involved making sure that the results go into the registry and that when they're published, they get added to improve our record and then keep it improved. But maybe there's some disincentives that need to happen too. I don't know. There's a lot of PIs here, but I was thinking about the REB not approving future trials until the results have been reported to either the criteria before, and I think that's not a lot to actually do, but I imagine it would be unpopular. Following the criteria, 1 year to get from the primary completion date to have the baseline trial registry results populated. Yep.
And that you've identified that as really hitting a home run with being compliant with it?
I looked around at the no. Although Alberta does have a registration officer, right? So I imagine they're probably a little better. But some of the other universities are quite bad. So some of the Ontario universities are much higher on the list of unreported than even Manitoba. So it would look good for Manitoba to be able to improve it fast. And like I said, with only 20 or so trials, we could easily be the best in Canada. I saw that as an opportunity for us to quickly improve. But incentives or disincentives, one of the things is turned into an incentive. Maybe you get a reward from the university if you have all of your studies, rather than, or both, report results, get something that's of use to a PI, not report results, you won't have your next REB application approved or held up, something like that.
You don't get promotion.
Linking it to tenure and promotion would also be a very, very strong way of doing it.
Those people are already tenured.
Yeah. Here's the thing: the vast majority of these PIs are tenured already. So I doubt that would be very effective to do that. But another that is a good one. Yeah. Unfortunately, yeah. I would say almost all of the PIs that are delinquent are tenured.
Ones that have been doing, trials there 30 years.
That's if you look at the numbers, that tends to be what it is. Also at the U of M, I've looked in, industry-sponsored trials are much better than the investigator-initiated trials. And the investigator-initiated trials are more likely to have the lower quality registration, at least from what I've seen, and less likely to have the results reported in the registry. They're far more likely to have a PubMed affiliated with it, but no registry results. And I like the idea of having some of the results in the registry, because sometimes if you publish in a paywalled journal, then the person from the general public is not going to be able to access it unless they know about Sci-Hub, which basically opens all publications up to all people, but we're not supposed to use it because it's against the law, so don't use it.
Yeah, because I think in natural geeks would be clinical.gov that if a guy keeps registering and they're delinquent in reporting, they could block future registration.
Yeah, except that's a not-for-profit organization run out of the United
That seems
States.
like we're just passing
Yeah,
the
yeah.
baton.
I think the individual sponsors. So for investigator initiated and those at the university here, that's the university at some point. I think that's where we have to.
So just to be clear, our REB approves every single change that happens. So they're notified at our REB. They just don't have the capacity to follow up and track things down and keep up with people. So they have to approve every change. So Shelley is the gatekeeper, so you can't just register a trial. A guy can't log in as Lauren and register something. It has to get an account through Shelley. So everything gets monitored through the university. So we just don't have a person that has the time to actually follow up.
And the other thing is that you can't get a clinical trial approved at this university without having registered it. That's a good thing that's been in place since 2010, I think, at this university, which is great. That's a good step. Now, the other half of that step is we need to make sure that everybody reports those results, because clearly it's not happening. If we've had to register since 2012, as you can see, there's been a large jump in the number of trials that were registered. Actually, I'm guessing from that large spike, that was the year the university made everybody register ongoing trials. So that's probably 2012. Everybody had to register the ones that were still going that hadn't been registered yet. They were told to when they had to review. And so we've been registering lots of them, but it looks like actually our reporting is decreasing over time, which is not good. So some more information on the AllTrials campaign. It is international. There's all kinds of groups from all around the world, including big pharmaceutical companies. So if you have one of those sponsors, then they take care of most of the results reporting and registration, so it happens automatically. And that's great. The more people that sign up for this and follow the guidelines of AllTrials, the better. I think our treatment decisions that people make will be more informed, and we hopefully will have less waste. But this university at the moment has a ways to go. Is there any questions to discuss?